I wake before the sun most days, not because there is anything pressing to tend to, but because the house has a way of breathing differently in the dark hours, the boards softening and the furnace clicking as if it were clearing its throat, and in that half-light I can pretend for a minute that Ruth is just in the next room humming to herself while she decides whether to start the coffee or put on her slippers first. I lie still and listen to the plain sounds of an old Nebraska morning. The hush before the first pickup rattles down our street toward the grain elevator, and the distant whistle of a freight that always made my wife smile because she said it reminded her of vacations we never took. And I tell myself that I will get up and move these old bones and let the day happen, even if all the day intends to do is leave me where it found me, alone at the small oak table with a mug that tastes faintly of dish soap and the paper folded to the obituaries before I realize I have done it again. I am 79, and I have become a man of rituals that did not seem like rituals when I still had someone to share them with. I warm the kettle for exactly the time it takes me to count to 120 under my breath. I measure the coffee with the bent tablespoon. Ruth bent herself on the side of the sink one Thanksgiving when she was convinced the yams were burning and still laughed when she had to pry it out with a butter knife. I open the back door to let in the weather even in winter because the air reminds me of chores on my father's farm when cold had a purpose and not just a memory. And then I sit and read headlines that mostly make me tired, and I scan for names I know, and for a moment I cannot remember whether the family pictured in a funeral home had once bought raffle tickets from our church, or whether I only think so because grief shapes everything to look familiar. The house is modest, and it is tidy because nothing new comes into it anymore, and what is already here knows its place. There is the recliner that lists a little to the right because I have always sat in it crooked. There is the frame with Ruth's photograph that my son says should be digitized and saved someplace safe, which is a word that sounds to me like a locked cabinet in a room I am not allowed to enter. There is the coat rack with the same 2 sweaters I rotate week to week even, though my closet holds more than I will ever need. And if you asked me whether I am comfortable, I would say yes, because comfort is not the same as joy, and I have learned to live without one while still telling the truth about the other. Church is on Sundays if my knees will carry me down the 3 steps to the car without that lightning pinch that warns me not to be foolish, and the pharmacist greets me by name and jokes about the football team as if small talk were a duty he performs with kindness. And once a month there is breakfast at the VFW, where we talk about people who have moved away or died as if they were late to a meeting, and we are keeping their seats warm. Afterward, I drive the long way past the high school, where my son once ran laps under the glaring lights, and I remember how his breath came out in white puffs one November evening, and how proud I felt, and how I did not say it, because my own father had taught me that a boy's head should not be filled with praise he has not earned twice over, and I think that maybe in that silence there is a seed of what came after, even if it is too simple to pin a whole life on a single moment. My son is named Daniel, though everyone calls him Dan except for me, because I am the one who held the Bible over his cradle and whispered the name like a promise, and if you were to ask an outsider they would say that we are not estranged in any formal sense. We live in the same town, we have the same dentist, we nod at the same people on the 4th of July, but there has grown between us a carefulness that feels like walking across a frozen pond and listening for the sound of a crack you cannot quite hear, and when we speak on the phone the pauses are longer than the sentences, and when we see each other in person we make lists of practical things we can do together. Change the smoke detector batteries, trim back the lilac, check the water heater, because practical is safe and feelings are not. And in those lists I sometimes hear the clink of coins as if we were paying toll to cross some invisible bridge neither of us built and both of us resent. After Ruth died, it seemed to me that grief would be the thing to draw us close, that the shared loss would strip away everything else and leave 2 men who could admit tenderness without shame. But death does not end arguments so much as it steals. The referee, and there were days when I could not tell whether I was speaking to my son or to a version of him I had assembled out of old trophies, stubborn pride, and my fear of being unneeded. He would stand in the doorway looking at the list, magneted to my refrigerator, and ask which items I wanted done first, and I would say something like, "Whatever you think," which is as unhelpful as it sounds, and then he would say he had promised his own boy he would make it to the game on time, and I would nod, and we would both pretend the afternoon had not shrunk to the size of a pill bottle label. There were other complications, of course there were. Money saved and money spent. A loan I offered without being asked when his contracting business hit a dry patch, and a repayment plan we never wrote down because I still believed in handshakes, and he believed in not being beholden. A remark I made about his drinking that came out sour because I was tired and scared after a dizzy spell that turned out to be nothing. An apology he gave that felt like a receipt and not a repair. And always that. Unspoken competition with my brother Caleb, whose name still has a way of sounding like the scrape of a chair across linoleum when you are already on edge. Caleb and I were close the way boys who share chores are close. You know the rhythms of each other's bodies because you have thrown hay in the same heat and thawed the same piped water in the same cold, and then life did what it does, and we married. And found work, and moved a dozen or so miles from each other, and could go weeks without talking, even though our lives would have fit inside the same paper sack. Yet there was a thread I thought would never snap. And when he fell sick last winter, and the doctor said the word that makes almost everyone look at the floor, I told myself that I would sit with him every day, even if the conversation was only breath and the sound of the clock in the living room of that little house outside Beatrice. Dan visited once, and the visit did not go well, because illness strips a man down to the wires, and he can look like everything you fear in yourself, and my son has always hated that kind of nakedness. Afterward he said something about Caleb's stubbornness, about old men who hoard regrets like canceled stamps, and I said that sometimes stubbornness is what keeps your heart beating through the night, and he said that I had never understood the cost of the way my generation carries pain. Like a badge, and I said that his generation thinks a feeling is healed because it has been spoken out loud, and we both stopped because we were getting too close to the marrow. When Caleb died, the weather was that bright, false kind of warm that comes too early and makes you believe you have earned spring, and I ironed a shirt I should have replaced years ago and tucked a clean handkerchief into my pocket the way Ruth taught me, and I braced myself for the peculiar way funerals turn into potlucks of memory, with people serving portions of stories that are half true and wholly sincere. And then, in the weeks that followed, there were calls from his attorney and envelopes that smelled of copy toner, and the heavy knowledge that a life that begins in a room with wailing ends in a room with papers and initials, and a notary who offers you a pen as if it were a tissue. I did not think much about what Caleb might leave to whom, because there is an indecency to counting someone else's money before the dirt has settled, and anyway, I have enough for the modest way I live, and not much appetite for more. But I knew that. Dan was curious in the way a man who has watched his father grow old becomes curious, nervously, about the arithmetic of it all. There were 2 messages on my machine from him that week that were as polite as postcards, inquiring about dates and times, and I told myself that perhaps this was an opening he did not know how to make any wider, and when I called him back and said the attorney had asked me to bring next of kin to the reading, he cleared his throat and said he could come by and drive me, and the relief I felt was embarrassingly large and immediately pricked by the thought that I should not rely on rides like a child when I still have a license and a car that starts on the second turn even in February. I would like to say that the days leading up to that appointment were calm, but old men have a way of pacing through their own heads even when their feet are still. I found myself rearranging the same drawer 3 times, placing the screwdriver with the cracked blue handle where it belongs, moving it, returning it again, as if order in a kitchen could make up for disorder in a life, and at night I lay awake and remembered things I had not asked Caleb, not worthy things like the names of people, in photographs, but small, stubborn things like why he always ate the heel of the bread first, and whether he believed that a man's regrets follow him beyond the grave or dissolve with his breath like fog over a field. In all of this there was a tender, humiliating hope that Dan and I might, sitting side by side in a room designed for straight backs and careful voices, find our way back to something that felt like family, that a moment of shared silence might soften whatever calcified between us, even if we never named it. I imagined us afterward going for a late breakfast at the diner with the cracked vinyl booths and the waitress who calls every man Hon. Imagined him telling me about his boys' college applications and how the roof job out near the river went after the windstorm. Imagined myself making some joke about my hearing so I would not have to ask him to repeat himself, and imagined, most of all, that he would look at me the way he used to. Look at me when I had the answers and the world still seemed like a thing we could lift together if we just got the angle right. If this sounds naive, I will not dispute it. A widower can mistake any errand for a chance at redemption, and a father can turn an appointment into a wish so fast he does not notice it happening. But that morning, as I buttoned my cuffs and decided to wear the tie Ruth always called my honest blue, I felt as ready as I have felt for anything since she died, as if the day would either mend something or finally tear it clean, and that, too, would be a kind of mercy. The morning of the appointment arrived with that washed-out kind of light that makes even familiar streets look undecided about themselves, and I took extra care with the tie Ruth had called my honest blue, tugging the knot until it sat exactly where a respectful knot ought to sit. And when I heard Dan's truck pull up with the uneven idle, I know as well as my own breath, I felt an unreasonable spike of gratitude that he had come for me like a son ought to come for his father on a hard day. And I picked up the folder with Caleb's letters I'd found in the cedar box because it seemed right to carry some piece of him into the room where his life would be translated into paper and signatures and legally sufficient language that could never sound like him, no matter how careful the attorney tried to be. And as I eased myself into the passenger seat, I told Dan he could take Maple instead of the highway because the lights would be kinder at this hour, which he acknowledged with that clipped little affirmative that does not invite conversation. So we drove in the careful silence of men who do not trust their words to behave, past the shuttered feed store and the diner already half full of men in caps nursing the first coffee of the day, and then the courthouse square where the elm that finally survived Dutch disease throws a shade so wide I always think of a tent revival and Ruth's hand squeezing mine when the hymn swelled. The attorney's office sat above a long, narrow shop that used to sell shoes and now sells whatever the internet does not. A place of candles that smell like places we have not been, and picture frames that tell you what family should look like when the camera catches them at their best. We climbed the stairs slowly because my knees and because Dan prefers measured speed when he does not know what's waiting at the top, and a young woman with a perfect ponytail and a cardigan the color of oatmeal opened the frosted door before we could knock, asked our names even though we were the only ones on the landing, and ushered us past a coat tree that held 2 rain slickers and a hat, with the dusty dignity of something that used to sit on a better head than mine. The conference room was the sort of room where people use their indoor voices even when they are alone. The carpet a color somewhere between beige and apology, the blinds arranged so that the light came in polite stripes across the table, and on that table was a bowl of mints sweating in their wrappers like nervous guests, a yellow pad with the attorney's tidy handwriting pressed into it, and a coaster set printed with little Latin phrases I pretended to understand while I tried not to tremble with the fact of what we were doing there, which was nothing less than letting words close a body I had known since the day we chased each other through our father's corn rows and came up filthy and proud and scolded as if joy were a misdemeanor. The attorney himself, a compact man with a necktie knot that looked like it had been cinched during an argument, introduced himself as Mr. Ellerby, extended a hand that was dry and decisive, and told us that the reading would be brief because Caleb had been a clear thinker even when illness had driven him to brevity, and as he spoke I studied the fine wrinkles at the corners of his eyes and the way he referred to my brother as "your late brother Caleb," in a tone that balanced formality and something approaching respect. And for a moment I relaxed, because respect is a thin but serviceable blanket on a cold bench. And I thought, maybe we could get through this without tearing anything that had not already been torn. He began in that steady cadence people who read for a living develop, a cadence that carries the listener even when the meaning wants to smash itself against your chest. And he spoke of debts settled and small bequests to the church where Caleb had tuned the piano before the tremor began, a gift to the volunteer fire department whose pancake breakfasts he never missed. And then he came to the part where the estate, modest but honest as a day's labor, would be disposed of, and I felt Dan lean back as if to give the words room to land, and then lean forward when he realized that the words were landing in a way he had not prepared for, which was the moment Mr. Ellerby said that my brother had directed that the proceeds from the sale of his house and the accounts that bore his name should pass to me, to be used as I saw fit, along with the tin box of war letters and the dog tags he wore on a chain that left a pale mark on his chest long after the rest of the tan had faded, and the tools in the garage which Caleb, in a line that made me smile despite everything, described as broken enough to be familiar, but not so broken a stubborn man can't fix them. I did not look at Dan at first because I wanted to hear the rest without being tugged off course by whatever expression sat on his face. A face I helped shave the first time he held a razor and turned to me because the mirror was not generous. And when the attorney paused to let the sentence find its period, I felt the pull anyway. The silent heat of my son beside me tightening like a belt you have to notch one hole farther than you want, and I turned and saw in him not surprise exactly, and not grief either, but a calculation I have seen on job sites when the bid comes back higher than you expected, and you start counting not dollars, but days and disappointments, and I realized with an unpleasant clarity that he had constructed an outcome in his mind where Caleb, who had no children and no spouse to argue on their behalf, would have nudged his future with one last push, that he had built a little story for himself in which he finally got something from the uncles and fathers, who had always told him to be grateful for what he had, and when that story crumbled in a handful of polite phrases, its dust went right into his eyes, and he did not forgive me for standing there without coughing. There was a low, mechanical hum in the room, maybe the air handler or the vending machine in the hallway. And over that hum, Dan cleared his throat with a sharpness that made the paralegal look up, and he asked, not of Ellerby but of me, whether I had known, which was a question with too many layers for a room like this, and I said that I had not, that Caleb and I had spoken of pain and weather and the memory of our mother's biscuits, not of money, and Dan nodded in that clipped way again, but the nod deepened into a shake, and the shake became a small, involuntary laugh the way a stumble can become a fall if you don't catch yourself fast enough. And he said with an ugly precision that sounded rehearsed or at least familiar in his mouth, that it figured that in this family the old men take care of the old men, and everyone else learns to fend for themselves. And I told him softly that this was neither fair nor true, because the old men in this family had cut their hands open, teaching the younger ones what to carry and what to put down, and he stared at the mints like they were the ones speaking riddles he could not afford to misunderstand. Mr. Ellerby tried to regain the current by noting that there were practical matters to attend to, and a simple procedure for probate that would not be unduly burdensome given the size of the estate, and would we care to sign the acknowledgment of receipt so that the next steps could proceed without delay. And I reached for the pen because the world moves forward whether or not your heart is ready. But Dan put his hand over mine, not roughly but with a pressure that spoke of a lifetime of doing and lifting and holding things shut, and he said, still watching the mints, that there was no need to rush because he had something to say that he should have said a long time ago, and I felt the old, foolish hope jump like a fish at the surface that perhaps he meant an apology for the hard words we had thrown at each other, or at least a truce that could carry us through the morning. But then he turned to me with a practiced quiet I recognized from the nights he decided to leave a job site rather than throw his tools at a wall, and he said, "You're dead to me," in a voice as dry as July stubble, and the room did that thing rooms do when someone lobs a thunderbolt indoors, which is to grow very small and very large at the same time, while forks of silence connect everyone's eyes to the same useless place on the carpet. I do not remember breathing for a moment, only the peculiar sensation that the sentence did not strike my skin where he aimed it, but slid under my ribs and came to rest somewhere behind my sternum like a bad nail I would carry for the rest of my days. I remember thinking absurdly of the time Ruth stood in the kitchen doorway and told me the tumor was small and the doctors were confident, and how my body had gone cold and wet, then even though the day was mild, and how later I could not explain to Caleb that the shock was not loud but slow, a seep rather than a scream. And now here I was astonished at the way grief can learn new tricks at my age. The attorney began to say something about emotions being understandable on days like this, words that were no doubt meant to be oil on the hinge, but Dan held up one finger without looking away from me and asked if I knew how it felt to be treated. Like a man who is good for errands and batteries and a spare 50 when the bank won't clear your check until Monday. If I had ever noticed that I only called him when something broke, or when I wanted company that would not talk back, and did, I realize that while I and Caleb had been perfecting the art of stoic sacrifice, he had been shouldering his way through a life that never once offered him the softness I still expect from the world, because I am old and I have memories, and somewhere in that rush there were true things and crooked things braided together so tightly I could not pull them apart without making a mess. And when I said his name, not Dan, but Daniel, because syllables can call a man back to an earlier, gentler self, he flinched like I had tossed water on him and said he did not want my prayers or my corrections or my endearments, only my absence. I am ashamed to admit that a part of me, the part that has lived through long winters and understands conservation at the most primitive level, folded in on itself so quickly that I nearly nodded, because surrender can feel like wisdom when defeat is inevitable. But then I looked at my hands, the same hands that had steadied his bicycle seat and checked his fever and pushed $100 bill into his palm the night he confessed that he was in over his head and could not see a way out without somebody's mercy. And I said as gently as I could in that room where everything wanted to be loud that I did not know how to die for him, while still waking up in the same town and reaching for the same coffee cup, that I could give him space or silence, but not a fatherless world. And he smiled in that cold way I have seen on foremen who have just convinced themselves they are right to fire a man with a bad back. And he repeated himself very softly as if trying the words on for fit. Dead to me. And the paralegal made a small sound that might have been sympathy and might have been irritation that the morning had turned into a play. We signed the paper anyway because paper does not care how you feel about it, and I shook Mr. Ellerby's hand and thanked him with more dignity than I felt, and I waited for Dan to walk with me down the stairs because even in a ruin, courtesy survives, but he stood staring at the blinds as if they could instruct him in how to let less light in, so I descended alone, counting each step the way boys count free throws, and when I reached the sidewalk the heat had come up and the wind had gone down and the elm tossed a lazy pattern over the hood of Dan's truck, and I understood, with a clarity that had nothing to do with law or mints or careful voices, that whatever path we had been on was now broken clean, that the day had set a stake in the ground and tied our ropes to different rings, and that everything after this would be measured against the sentence my son had chosen to live by. When I left the attorney's office that day, the echo of my son's words stayed lodged in my ears like a splinter that could not be pulled free, and though I told myself I would not let the humiliation settle into my bones, by the time we reached the truck and he unlocked the door without a glance in my direction, I knew the line had been crossed in a way we could never step back from. The ride home was silent except for the rattle of loose tools in the glove box, and the silence was not the kind that allows thinking. It was the kind that presses down on your chest and makes you question every breath you take, as if even breathing too loudly might set off another round of contempt. I stared out of the window at the familiar town that looked suddenly foreign to me, the laundromat with its red neon sign blinking, "Open." Though I knew half the machines had been broken for years, the Methodist church with its peeling paint where Ruth had once sung hymns with a voice that made the old women stop fanning themselves, and I felt like a stranger riding through the wreckage of a place that no longer had room for me. When we pulled up in front of my house, Dan did not bother to cut the engine. He just left it idling as though he were delivering a parcel that did not require a signature, and when I put my hand on the door handle to thank him, to reach for some last scrap of civility, he cut me off with a sharp, flat "don't," and that was all. The truck rolled away before my feet had steadied themselves on the gravel drive, and I stood there with the folder of Caleb's letters in my hand like some relic of a better world, watching the dust settle in the taillights until the road was empty. That night the house seemed to lean in closer, every tick of the wall clock loud enough to feel in my throat, and I tried to busy myself with small chores, wiping down the counter that was already clean, folding the dish rag into a square and then into a triangle and then back again. But nothing could disguise the taste of that sentence. "You're dead to me." And the more I repeated it silently, the more it seemed to grow teeth, gnawing at every memory I thought was safe. I poured myself a glass of water and set it down untouched, and when the phone rang, I almost leapt at the sound. But it was only one of those recorded voices urging me to change my insurance, and the ordinary cruelty of that timing made me sit down, hard in Ruth's chair as though she might still be able to steady me. Sleep was impossible, and so I wandered from room to room, my shadow stretching itself across the old carpet, and in the mirror above the dresser I saw a face I did not recognize, not because it was aged and tired, but because it looked stripped of something more essential, as though a man who loses the respect of his son loses also the outline of who he has been. The first hints of escalation came not the next day but in the days that followed, when the phone calls started. Not calls to me, but calls about me. A neighbor stopped me by the mailbox and asked in a careful voice if everything was all right between Dan and me, because she had heard from someone who had heard from him that I was not doing so well, that perhaps I was confused about my finances, and that maybe I should think about letting him help me sort things out. I laughed weakly and said I was fine, but the laughter rang hollow in my ears, and later that afternoon I overheard two men at the diner talking about how sad it is when old folks lose their grip, how dangerous it can be when they hold on to property and money they don't understand anymore. I knew those words had not sprouted on their own. They had been planted by someone who had a reason to make me look small, and the realization that my own son was the gardener of that poison filled me with a dread I could hardly swallow. When Dan came by the following Sunday, he did not step into the house. He stood on the porch with his arms crossed like a man collecting a debt, and he asked for the keys to Caleb's truck, which had been sitting under my shed since the funeral. I told him gently that Caleb had left those things to me, not out of favoritism, but out of trust, and that I intended to keep them as they were until I decided otherwise. And he gave me a smile so tight it looked more like a crack in stone and said that I was being selfish, that Caleb would have wanted the tools and the truck to go to someone who could use them, not rot in the hands of an old man who would never again turn a wrench with real purpose. I said nothing, because I knew that anything I said would be twisted back at me. But inside I felt the slow heat of shame and anger working against each other, one telling me I had failed as a father, the other telling me I was being stripped of my rights like a man already declared absent before the obituary has even been printed. The humiliation grew sharper when I discovered that he had spoken to the attorney behind my back, questioning whether I was of sound mind when I signed the acknowledgement of Caleb's will, and though Ellerby assured me that nothing could change the fact of the papers, The very knowledge that my son had tried to unseat me from my own place in the family shook me deeper than any stranger's insult could have done. It was not just mistrust. It was erasure, the attempt to paint me as a man already gone, a body waiting to be moved aside. That night, I sat at the kitchen table and tried to write a letter to Dan, tried to find the words that could cut through his suspicion and bitterness. But every sentence broke down into fragments of apology and accusation, and in the end, I tore it up and fed it to the stove flame because nothing sounded right. Nothing sounded like a bridge strong enough to hold us. By the end of the week, I was hearing from cousins I had not spoken to in years, calling to ask whether it was true I was planning to spend Caleb's money recklessly, whether it was true I had refused to let my own son help me with my accounts, and I realized that the first small stone Dan had kicked down the hill was now gathering mass and speed, becoming an avalanche of suspicion that would bury me if I did not find a way to stand against it. I looked around my house, the photographs of Ruth in her church dress, the shoebox of Daniel's childhood drawings, the checkbook with its neat rows of figures, and I thought, this is my life, and if I do not protect it, then I have already surrendered it to a boy who thinks his father is nothing more than a stumbling inconvenience. The first escalation was not the shouting in the lawyer's office, nor even the cruel sentence in the car. It was this slow, deliberate campaign to shrink me down until I fit the shape of incompetence he wanted to hang on me, so that when the next battle came, he could point to the rumors and nods of the neighbors and say, "See, it isn't me. It is everyone who knows him." And as I sat there in the dark, listening to the creak of the rafters and the faint rattle of the window against its frame, I realized with a kind of quiet horror that my own son was not only ashamed of me, but preparing the world to accept my disappearance. And that knowledge was heavier than grief, heavier even than loneliness, because it meant that the blood I had passed down was working against me, and the fight ahead would not be against strangers, but against the one man I had once believed would never abandon me. The breaking point did not arrive in a single moment of shouting or slammed doors, but in the heavy quiet of a Tuesday morning when I found a letter in my mailbox addressed in Dan's careful handwriting, the kind of deliberate strokes he used in grade school when he wanted the teacher to believe he was serious about the assignment. And though I stood in the driveway holding it as though it might burn me, I knew before I opened it that no good would come from what it carried. Inside, on lined paper torn from a pad I recognized from his office, was a note that did not bother with greetings or softening phrases, only a declaration that he intended to contest the will on grounds of undue influence, that he would speak to the court about my decline, that neighbors and relatives could testify to my forgetfulness, my frailty, my inability to manage what had been entrusted to me. And reading those words, I felt the kind of hollow collapse a man feels when a roof caves in and he is left staring at the open sky where once there had been shelter. It was not simply a legal maneuver. It was an accusation that my very existence as a capable man had ended, and worse, it was penned by the hand I had once guided across a page when he learned to write his name. That evening, I placed the letter on the table and sat staring at it for hours, and memories came unbidden, memories I had not summoned in years. The winter when Dan was 10, and nearly lost his fingers to frostbite because he would not come inside. From sledding, and how I had sat with him by the stove all night rubbing his hands, whispering that pain meant the blood was still fighting its way back, and the day he stood on a stage at the high school auditorium clutching a medal from the track meet, searching the crowd for my face until our eyes met, and he broke into the kind of grin that makes a father feel like he has been knighted by the world. All of it came rushing back, not as comfort but as accusation, because how could a boy who once looked at me with such trust now prepare to strip me of my dignity in front of strangers? When Ellerby called to confirm that he had received a notice of Dan's intention, his voice was cautious, as if he feared the words might break me, and I told him calmly that I would appear wherever needed and speak the truth as I knew it. But after I hung up the phone. I felt my knees weaken, and I had to grip the counter to keep from sliding to the floor. I realized then that this was not just a family quarrel but a war for the definition of who I was, and the battlefield was not only the courthouse but the eyes of everyone in town who would hear pieces of the story and decide for themselves whether I was still a man worth listening to. The weeks that followed blurred together with small humiliations that cut deeper than I let on. Whispers at church that stopped when I walked by, a banker who offered too much help with my deposit as if he thought I could not add, a cousin's wife who telephoned to ask whether I needed someone to explain the paperwork because these things can get confusing. And through it all I could sense Dan pulling the strings, not loudly but persistently, building a portrait of me as a relic whose time had passed. And yet, in the midst of this, a single unexpected revelation turned the entire conflict inside out. Because one evening, as I sat with Caleb's tin box of letters, I found at the very bottom an envelope with my name written on it in Caleb's shaky hand, sealed but never sent, and inside was a message that explained everything. He wrote that he was leaving what little he had to me, not because I needed it more, but because he trusted me to do what was right, that he had considered leaving it to Dan but could not bring himself to reward a man who, in his words, has already squandered more chances than most men are given, and that he believed I alone would understand that an inheritance is not a prize, but a burden that must be carried with honor. Reading those words, my heart split between sorrow and clarity, because in them was the proof that this was not about favoritism or accident, it was about judgment, and Caleb, who had watched us both for a lifetime, had seen something in my son that I had been too blind or too hopeful to admit. The midpoint of the story was not the courtroom papers or the rumors in town. It was this letter, this unshakable testimony from a dying man that my son was not the victim he imagined himself to be, but the architect of his own bitterness. And that the inheritance had been left in my hands not to wound him, but to spare him from further waste. That night I did not sleep, but for the first time since the lawyer's office I felt a kind of fierce stillness inside me, as though I had been wandering lost in a storm and suddenly glimpsed the line of the horizon. I knew the path ahead would be uglier than anything yet, that Dan would not forgive Caleb's judgment any more than he had forgiven mine, but I also knew that I would not let his campaign of slander define me. If my son wanted a battle for my very identity, then he would have it, but not with anger or shouting. He would have it with the stubborn clarity of a man who has nothing left to lose except the truth. The days after Caleb's letter did not bring relief so much as a steadier pulse to my fear, because once a man knows why another man chose him, he has to decide whether he will carry that choice without flinching, and knowing that Caleb had seen in me a keeper of burdens rather than a collector of prizes made me feel both honored and cornered, as if the only decent path left was the hardest one, and the world, obliging as ever when it comes to testing a man's resolve, began to tighten its screws. In ways that were small at first, and then suddenly not small at all. The first screw turned when 2 officers from the county showed up on my porch for a wellness check, their hands resting near their belts in that professional way that is meant to soothe but never does, explaining in careful tones that they had received an anonymous call expressing concern that I was becoming confused and might be at risk of exploitation, and while I kept my voice steady and offered coffee I could not swallow, I laid out my pills by day and showed them the neat rows in my check register and even, God help me, recited the governor's name and the date to satisfy whatever box they needed to tick. And when they left with polite assurances, I stood in the doorway after the screen had slapped shut and understood that whatever came next would not be argued in private, because my son had decided to make my competence a matter for anyone with a badge or a whisper. It would have been enough to endure that humiliation and let it pass, but escalation has a way of arriving like a summer storm that first darkens the sky and then cracks it open, and 2 days later a tow truck rolled slow up my drive dragging a flatbed behind it like a threat with wheels, and a young man in a branded polo stepped out to announce he had an order from Mr. Daniel to pick up his late uncle's truck and selected tools, waving a piece of paper that looked official from a distance and like a printout from someone's kitchen when I held it in my hand. I told him calmly that the property was part of an estate already acknowledged by the court and that no one had the right to remove a single wrench without my say-so, and when he shrugged and said he was paid by the hour and could wait while I called someone, I felt the old farmer in me, the part raised to speak quietly and carry heavy things, come forward, and I stepped between him and the shed and asked him to leave my land, not with anger, but with that cold simplicity men understand, and after a long look he did, but he did not go before, taking 3 photographs with his phone, and I knew to whom those pictures would be delivered. That evening, Ellerby confirmed what I already suspected, that Dan had filed a temporary petition to be named my conservator in the interim, citing community concerns and my supposed erratic decisions since Caleb's death, and while the judge had denied the emergency request, he had set a date for a hearing 3 weeks hence, which felt to me like 3 minutes and 3 years at once, because time behaves strangely when your name is dragged into a courtroom to be weighed and measured like an animal at auction. I slept badly and woke worse, and in the half-light between both states the phone rang with the flat insistence of trouble, a collections office in Omaha asking to verify charges on a card I had never seen, let alone used, and by noon a second call. Arrived about a hardware store account in my name with a mailing address that matched Dan's shop, and in the rapid, clattering way truth sometimes reveals itself, I understood that squandered chances was not just Caleb's old man judgment, but a ledger of debts my son had been concealing under paint and excuses, and that the campaign to declare me unfit was not only about pride or even inheritance, it was about access, because a man who controls an old man's accounts can plug the leaks in his own sinking boat without ever learning to patch a hull. I went to the bank and told the manager I wanted fraud alerts on every account and a hard stop on any new lines of credit in my name, and she nodded with the kindness small-town people reserve for men who show up dressed in their best shirt for battle. And then I walked down to the post office and rented a box so thick with brass it looked like it could bite a thief, because if Dan wanted to intercept my mail, he would at least have to break a lock to do it. I kept the letter from Caleb in my breast pocket like a talisman, and I took it out in the evenings when the house got too dark too fast, and I would read the lines where he wrote that I was to use the money for good work, not for comfort. And I knew then what good work would mean, because if Dan was determined to cast me as an obstacle between him and the only ease he could imagine, then I would choose to be a different kind of obstacle entirely, the kind a man encounters when he realizes the path he has chosen will never lead him home. I called Ellerby and told him to draft papers placing Caleb's bequest into a charitable trust in my brother's name for scholarships at the community college trades program. Welders, electricians, the sorts of work where your hands earn your pride, and to reserve a separate, modest trust for my grandchildren, payable directly to them for tuition or tools when they asked for it themselves at 18 and older, with no role for their father beyond, receiving a courteous notice after the fact, and while Ellerby hesitated, knowing what such a move would provoke, I told him quietly that I had been provoked enough for a lifetime, and that a man must sometimes stop arguing with rain and build a dam. Word of the trust did not remain secret for long, because secrets in towns like ours ride around in pickup beds and church bulletins, and one afternoon Dan arrived without knocking, shoulders squared into the doorway like a battering ram, demanding. To know whether it was true, I intended to launder family money through pet students and strangers, and that word, strangers, lit me up, because those strangers were boys I had seen hauling hot shingles off roofs in August, and girls with grease under their nails who could diagnose a sputtering engine by listening to it the way a mother listens to a child's cough. and if my son could look at them and see only not us, then I had finally located the narrow gate through which his compassion no longer fit. He walked through the rooms of my house as if measuring them for an estate sale that would not require my permission, lifting Ruth's framed hymn from the mantel and setting it down too hard, tapping the window latches, opening the pantry as though proof of my incompetence might be hiding behind a can of tomatoes, and when he realized the trust papers were not here, that there would be nothing to seize, his face hardened into something like grief without softness, a grief that had in it the heat of envy and the sourness of a boy told no after too many unexamined yeses. And he said in a low, deliberate way that if I wanted a fight in public, I would have it, because he had witnesses and records and a timeline of my decline. And all at once I saw the shape of the trap he had been building, a structure made from every forgotten appointment and repeated story and misplaced key of the last 5 years, stacked like cordwood until it resembled not ordinary aging, but a prosecutable decay. I told him then about the letter, not to taunt him, but to anchor the conversation in a truth he could not twist. And I read aloud the sentence where Caleb said he had no wish to gild the ruin of a grown man who has not yet learned that money only solves money. And Dan laughed, a short, brittle sound that reminded me of a bolt snapping under too much torque, and he called his dead uncle a sanctimonious coward, and then he called me something worse, and I said his name the way a father does, when he wants to bring a son back from the edge of a cliff in the dark, but he had already stepped past the point where names could do any good. After he left, the house seemed to exhale like an animal after a chase, and I sat at the table and wrote a list longhand because a list is how you declare dominion over the things you can still control. I called my doctor and scheduled a full cognitive evaluation, not because I doubted myself, but because I wanted the paper and the seal and the signature to place beside the rumors. I called the sheriff, who knows me from the men's breakfast and from replacing the flag on his father's grave each Memorial Day, and I explained that there had been a tow attempt and an unauthorized order, and that I would appreciate a patrol swing by now and then, not to start a file, but to anchor one should it be required. I phoned the pastor and told him, in plain words, that I could not attend church this month because the whispers were louder than the hymns, and that a man should not be forced to worship while defending his name. And he cleared his throat and told me he had heard concerns, but also testimonies, and that he would be praying for reconciliation, and I thanked him while knowing that prayer without boundaries sometimes looks like complicity in these matters. The escalation moved from rumor to paperwork the following week when Ellerby forwarded me a copy of Dan's supplemental petition, thick with affidavits that hurt in ways only family can hurt, because there were signatures I recognized. My cousin, who borrows tools without returning them, a neighbor I once pulled out of a snowbank, even the owner of the diner who has poured me coffee for 20 years, and each affidavit was a little story about the time I repeated myself, or hesitated, or misplaced a check. And as I read them, I felt the ghastly sensation of watching small, ordinary stones of aging cemented into a wall that rose between me and the world I claimed to belong to. That night, unable to bear the house, I drove out to the county line and parked where the gravel turns to dirt and the sky opens wide, and I thought about the day, years ago, when Dan came to me shaking because he had backed his truck into the drainage box at the hardware store and couldn't afford the repair, and how I had paid cash and asked them to put my name on the receipt because it would sit better with me that way, and I realized with a slow, leaden certainty that he had learned, from that day, the wrong lesson entirely, that he had learned not that a father stands between a son and ruin, so the son can learn to stand on his own, but that there will always be a father standing there. And because there will always be a father, ruin is only ever a delay. I told Ellerby to be ready for ugliness, and I told him also to include in our filings the structure of the trust, and the medical evaluation, and the fraud alerts, not because I believed paper could save a man from betrayal, but because it can, At the very least, slow it down until the truth can catch up, and then I did the hardest thing I have done since Ruth's funeral. I wrote to my grandchildren directly, not to recruit them to my side or to poison them against their father, but to tell them that a fund would exist in their great-uncle's name for any training or schooling their hands desired, that the door would be open to them without conditions except the condition of asking, and that whatever else happened, they were loved by a man who had memorized their toddler voices and kept the napkin drawings they made at Thanksgiving in the same box where he kept Caleb's letters. I mailed those notes at the post office in the morning, and by afternoon Dan knew, which told me more than I wanted to know about who watches whose mail in this small town. The argument that followed was not a scene so much as a collapse at the quarry yard where Dan had been bidding on a small job to resurface the church lot. And when I arrived to deliver copies of the evaluation to him in good faith, he saw the envelope in my hand and assumed the worst, snatching it, tearing it, scattering my proof across the gravel like seed that would not take root in this ground, and in front of 3 men who work for him he demanded I admit my incompetence and rescind the trust and sign a temporary power of attorney for the sake of avoiding a spectacle. And when I refused, he did what men do when righteousness runs out. He reached for shame, telling me, loud enough for his crew and quiet enough for the part of me that still wanted to be his father, that Ruth would be disgusted by the man I had become. And that line, not because it was clever but because it was desecration, cut me open in a new place. I do not remember all the words I spoke in return, but I remember telling him that he was wrong about his mother, that she had known the difference between love and obedience, and that I would honor her memory by refusing to place a frightened man in charge of a fortune he did not respect. And I remember watching his face go from red to white, which is the color of a man who finally understands that the door he has been banging on will not open no matter how hard he kicks it. That night, the phone rang again, and I let it ring, and then it rang again and kept ringing until the machine picked up, and then I played the message. Not because I expected an apology, but because a father listens. And what I heard was not contrition, but a proposition wrapped in threat. A voice saying that if I did not come to my senses, he would bring to court everything. And for a sickening instant I feared he meant the small, ugly secrets fathers and sons collect like splinters, my failures, his. And then I recognized the bluff, because there is nothing everything can do to a man who has already lost his son's respect. And I hung up and sat in Ruth's chair and watched the thin red line of evening sink behind the elms and realized the second escalation was complete. We were no longer a father and son trying to navigate grief and pride. We were adversaries locked in a contest over the meaning of a life, and the only way out was through. The day of the hearing came like a storm cloud that had been building for months, and when I rose before dawn I felt both as brittle as an old twig and as stubborn as a tree root buried deep in frozen ground. For I knew that this would not simply be a matter of documents and testimony, but the moment when my son and I would stand across from one another as adversaries, and there would be no more space left for illusions of reconciliation. I dressed with care, choosing the same dark suit I had worn to Ruth's funeral, pressing it the night before until the seams looked sharp again, and though the cloth hung looser on me than it once had, I took a kind of grim satisfaction in the way it settled on my shoulders, as if the weight of mourning had been repurposed into the armor of defiance. I drove myself to the courthouse because I wanted it known by everyone who whispered about my decline that these old hands still turned the wheel. And as I parked between 2 glossy new trucks, I saw my reflection in the glass and thought that if they were looking for a feeble relic, they would be disappointed, for the man staring back at me was still upright, still present, still capable of choosing his own steps. Inside the courtroom the air smelled of varnish and old paper, and the benches creaked under the weight of a few curious neighbors who had come, not out of loyalty, but out of the small-town hunger to watch a family tear itself apart. And when Dan entered flanked by his attorney, he did not glance in my direction. though I felt his presence like a draft through a broken window, and I braced myself. The judge, a woman I remembered from years ago when she was still a county clerk, began the proceedings with a steady voice, and soon enough the accusations were laid out, that I was forgetful, that I repeated myself, that I misplaced bills and confused dates, that I had signed documents without understanding them, and that I was therefore unfit to manage Caleb's estate and my own affairs. They produced affidavits from cousins and neighbors, stories twisted from small mishaps into a pattern of decline, and as I listened I felt my jaw tighten, not because the words were new, but because I could hear Dan's voice behind them, stitching them together into a net he hoped would drag me down. When my turn came, Ellerby stood with quiet confidence and produced the medical evaluations I had insisted upon, reports from doctors with clean signatures and long titles declaring me of sound mind, and he placed them before the judge with the steady assurance of a man laying stones in a foundation. But paper alone could not restore a father's dignity. And so, when the judge asked if I wished to speak, I rose slowly, feeling every gaze upon me, and I told them in a voice that trembled only at first that I was not a perfect man, that I had made mistakes, but that confusion was not one of them, and that my brother Caleb had entrusted me not because I was flawless but because I was faithful, and that fidelity does not vanish when the hair turns white. I spoke of the trust I had created for the trade students, of my grandchildren for whom I had left a door open, and I said plainly that my son's quarrel was not with my memory, but with my refusal to fund his carelessness. For a long moment the courtroom was still, and though I could feel Dan's eyes burning into me, I did not return the look, because the point of this battle was not to convince him. It was to mark the truth in a place where it could not be erased. The climax came not with the gavel, but with the silence that followed my words. For into that silence Dan finally spoke directly to me, not as a lawyer's client or petitioner, but as a son stripped of pretense, and he said, "You're destroying me to save your pride." And his voice cracked on the last word, and I felt the room tilt, because beneath the venom there was a wound, but it was a wound of his own making, and I could not bind it for him. I answered quietly that pride was a poor substitute for a father's love, but that a man who cannot stand on his own 2 feet will never learn the weight of either, and I knew as the words left me that they were final, that no appeal or affidavit could soften them. The judge ruled in my favor, denying the conservatorship and affirming my right to manage both my affairs and Caleb's trust, and the sound of the gavel was less a victory than a funeral bell for whatever remained between us. When we left the courthouse, the sunlight was bright and pitiless, and Dan walked past me without a word, his shoulders rigid, his face set in the grim mask of a man who had lost more than a case, and though part of me wanted to reach out, to catch his arm and remind him of sled rides and medals and all the years before bitterness took root, I did not, because the time for reminders had passed, and he had chosen to be my accuser rather than my son. I stood on the courthouse steps with the papers in my hand and felt not triumph but exhaustion, yet beneath it all a strange, steady calm, because the fight was over, the verdict was clear, and though the cost was the final severing of the bond, between us there was also a release, as if at last I could breathe without waiting for the next blow. That was the climax, not the sound of a gavel or the murmur of a crowd, but the quiet realization that I had defended my life against the one who should have guarded it, and that though the battle had left me scarred, it had also left me free. I woke the next morning with a kind of emptiness that was not despair, but a room that had finally been cleared of boxes, the dust still hanging but the floor visible at last, and I sat with my coffee at the small oak table and listened to the house. Breathe, and to the faint traffic on Maple as it threaded past the elm like a polite river, and I understood that the worst of the storm had spent itself, not because I had won anything worth boasting about, but because I had stopped surrendering. And that difference, though quiet, is the hinge on which an old life can turn into a new one without anyone outside noticing. I shaved carefully, as if I would be inspected by Ruth's bright eye, and then I drove across town to the community college where the dean, a woman with strong hands and steel-gray hair, had agreed that Caleb's name could hang above a small rack of loaner tools in the welding bay, and we stood together while the instructor fired his torch for the morning class and the first sparks snapped like fireflies against the dark curtain, and I told her about my brother's letters and his stubborn generosity, and she nodded in that way people do when they understand the weight of a story because they have carried their own. And she said the plaque would be simple and honest, the way good steel is, and I felt some part of me settle that had not settled since the day Dan's words cut the room in two. In the weeks after the hearing, the town's tongue grew tired, as tongues do when fed the same rumor without new seasoning, and the pew behind me at church stopped going silent when I stood to pass the plate, and the diner owner poured my coffee, without the too loud offer to help me count my change. And one afternoon the neighbor who had signed an affidavit shuffled to my porch with a lemon pie and an apology he could barely say, and I told him it was all right because forgiveness is cheaper than bitterness, and I have spent enough for 2 lifetimes. And he cried a little standing there in the smell of cut grass, and I realized how large the shadow of our trial had been when even small men were relieved to step out of it. I met with Ellerby to sign the last pages that made the trust a thing with legs and a spine, and, at his suggestion, I wrote a letter that would be kept with the papers, not legal but human, explaining that the money was meant to become work and dignity, not a cushion for idleness, and that my grandchildren, if they ever wished to ask, would find a door open that led not to my wallet but to their own future. And I sealed that letter with the same carefulness I had used when I sent Daniel his acceptance check to state all those years ago, the check he never thanked me for but cashed the same day. I did not call Dan, and I did not answer when he called, because the impulse to re-argue a verdict is strong in men who cannot accept that the gavel has fallen. Yet each time his number lit my phone, I felt the old pull of love like a rope across my chest, and I would sit until the light went dark, telling myself that silence is not vengeance but mercy when every word we might speak would only add another brick to a wall already too high to climb, and on the rare nights when regret came prowling, I would read again the line in Caleb's letter that said, "Inheritance is a burden to be carried with honor," and I would fall asleep with that phrase still warm in my mouth like a prayer I could finally believe. The first scholarship checks went out on a windy Thursday, and the dean invited me to watch the students open their envelopes. So I stood at the back of the shop in my honest blue tie while the instructor handed them out like licenses to breathe, and a narrow-shouldered boy with burnt sleeves looked up at the plaque and then at me and said, "Thank you," in a voice that had not yet learned to hide its own gratitude, and a young woman with oil on her cheek tucked the check into her boot as if to keep it near the ground, and I felt a fullness I had not felt since Ruth sang under the high ceiling of the church at Christmas time, a fullness that had nothing to do with triumph and everything to do with usefulness, which is the closest thing to joy I have left and perhaps the only kind worth trusting at my age. A week later, an envelope arrived in careful handwriting I did not recognize, and inside was a short note from my granddaughter, formal and a little stiff, thanking me for setting aside funds she had been told about by a friend at school and asking, if it was not an imposition, whether the trust could be used for a certification class in medical imaging because she thought she might want to see inside people in order to help them heal. And with the note was a small photograph of her at 10 with a crooked paper hat from Thanksgiving. And though I did not know how that picture had come to me, I knew who had taken it, and I sat a long while with it in my hand, not weeping, just letting my heart feel the weight of a bridge that might yet be built by someone who had not helped to burn the last one. I wrote back with a steady pen that yes, of course, that is exactly what the money is for, and I told her that her great-uncle would have liked the idea of a woman using machines to make the invisible visible, and I included a story about how she once drew a turkey on a diner napkin and insisted the tail feathers be counted correctly, and I mailed the letter at the late window so it would leave town before anyone had time to reconsider. I do not pretend that solitude has become sweetness, only that it is no longer a punishment, and while the house still feels too big in the evening and the chair across from me still keeps Ruth's shape like a tide line, I have found ways to fill the hours that do not depend on anyone else behaving better than they have proven they can. And sometimes I drive to the courthouse square and sit under the elm and watch the door where Dan and I became strangers with the same name. And I think about the sentence he chose and the sentence I answered with, and I understand now that both are true in their own small ways, because he declared me dead to him, and I declared myself alive to what remains. And somewhere between those declarations, a man can still make a life if he chooses. On Sundays I wear the blue tie, and on Tuesdays I visit the welding bay, and on Thursdays I take a pie to the neighbor who could not finish his apology. And these small circuits feel like the shape of a decent ending, not the kind of ending a younger man dreams of with reconciliations and speeches, but the ending that fits a winter field, furrows straight, tools cleaned, barn swept, lights off, and a note on the workbench that tells whoever comes next where the wrenches hang, and if one day a knock sounds and my grandson or granddaughter stands there with a question about school or work or how to sharpen a chisel, I will answer, and if no knock comes, I will still have done what a man can do when his name has been dragged through every room and returned to him, not shining but serviceable. And on mornings like this, when the kettle hums and the furnace clears its throat and the paper lays folded beside my cup, I think of Caleb's dog tags in their tin, and Ruth's hymn in its frame, and the students stepping into hot light, and I feel the quiet kind of pride that does not boast because it does not need to, and I tell the empty room that I forgive the living and bless the dead, and the room, finally, forgives me back.